It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to another session of our MIWI ongoing webinars with one of our fantastic senior mentors now. But what you may or may not know about Dr. McKinley is that he was one of our very first scholars in cohort one. And I still to this day remember seeing his application and saying, like, this is exactly the kind of misfit toy I was hoping would somehow find our program. And we didn't know each other. He just came out of the blue, and it's been an absolute pleasure, Gerald, getting to know you over these years, getting to watch you be successful in your work, in your, I know you've just demonstrating the kind of resilience and humanity that you're going to talk about today in terms of the work that you do with First Nations people. And I am so glad that you're going to be able to share this with our next generations of scholars. So, with that, I apologize. I'm not going to be able to stay for today's session, but I am looking forward to watching the recording, and I will leave you in the capable hands of Monica and Gerald. Thank you both.
You. Okay. Now I'm all
Gerald, would you
embarrassed.
like to share screen? I got it so you can.
Yes, I even did a PowerPoint with some of my pretty pictures from fieldwork. That's not it. Well, that is the PowerPoint, but that's not my pretty picture. Okay, so thanks for having me in, everyone. Um, Before I do that, I've got this kind of disclaimer I do. I'm going to use a script when I talk. For it's really important for me to be open about I live with very high levels of anxiety, and I have an overactive evaluative threat perception, and my increased anxiety destroys my short-term recall. So in contexts where I care about the people I'm talking with and I care about what they're hearing, my anxious brain takes over and my intelligent brain leaves the room. So I've learned over the years to use a script as an important communication skill. In cases like this, my anxious brain does not always have the cognitive processing skills I need to think on my feet. So without a script, I ramble, and I want to make sure that I connect the dots in an appropriate way. So I promise to take a break from the scripts as I need to, but please allow me my tool. After I'm done, we can unpick anything you want, and you can always interrupt me during the talk. So yeah, I am Gerald McKinley. I'm an associate professor and graduate chair in the public health program at the University of Western Ontario. I am part of the first cohort of MIWI, and then I was a peer mentor, and now I'm a mentor. And when she says senior mentor, I kind of imagine me like being wheeled into the room like a blanket over my lap, but that's not the case yet. But I am getting there. So I've been asked to talk about community engagement, and as an anthropologist, this really is my bread and butter. Um, I come from a tradition that trains students for a few terms in the classroom and then sends them off into the world on their own to connect with communities. Our success for our PhD often depends on or completely depends on our ability to engage with communities because that's where we gather our data. So I was lucky as a grad student because I worked close to home. I work in Ontario. I was trained in Ontario. But some of my cohort returned from 18 months in the field and they never wanted to see a yam ever again because that's all they ate for 18 months. Um, I've been going to the field, as we say, for close to 20 years. Um, and I'm still making mistakes and I'm still learning. During this talk, I'm going to focus on community engagement, but I also want to talk a bit about the stories that we encounter while doing this work, and how they can be a valuable source for data. Um, if we're open to them, these stories can help shape the direction of our research in positive and meaningful ways. In this talk, I aim to differentiate between community engagement as a practice and community engagement as a methodology. By practice, I mean a set of skills that is necessary to carry out an activity. We might call these soft skills. Those are things that you need to be able to do in order to give us access to the data that we're after while engaged in any field research. When I think about community engagement as a methodology, I'm thinking beyond skills and into the knowledge that we need to make not only the data that we're looking that we're looking at makes sense, but also how we can see alternative ways of finding answers and making sense of the messiness of the world at the community level. And importantly, not doing any damage to the places that we work. For those of you who work with quantitative data, think about this as the difference being able to do the calculations and knowing which analysis tools to use. Right, so it's one thing to be able to do math. It's another thing to be able to know what type of platforms and programs to use. The field site can be thought of as people's homes. The practices get you invited in. The practices remind us to bring food and to be ourselves. The methods ensure that we have not wasted their time. It raises questions such as how we organize data, how we structure our relationships, and what analysis tools will help us answer our questions. But also, and what is the impact that we're having on the lives of those people that we're partnered with in research? Here's my MIWI slide. So the MIWI program places a large emphasis on aligning methodologies with the goal of health equity research. In working with my friends in the program, I've started to see a potential methodological gap. Certainly, the quantitative and mixed method researchers have little trouble communicating, but I'm a qualitative researcher. I try to listen to what people say with as little as interference as possible from me. This is an important inductive step in capturing the world as our partners see it. Some of the most important research insights that I've gained have come while helping an elder make breakfast or joking with a group of men on a hunting trip. He has always been a valuable ally in my work. But the awareness of this methodological gap was reinforced when I was discussing narrative analysis, which is a big part of what I do, with a colleague in my home department, which is the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. And they asked me how I do it. And all I could say was, well, it depends, right? Because ultimately there's more than one way to skin a story. The MIWI experience ignited in me an interest in exploring a large variety of methods, which I've come to take for granted. I know, for example, how to apply the small stories methodology, but I've never taken the time to test a variety of methods with the same data sources to see how each approach impacts the results. I'm also a humanities-leaning social scientist. My undergrad is in Native Studies. My master's is in Theory and Criticism, which is where literary criticism and philosophy meet. PhDs in anthropology, and my postdoc was in psychiatry. But I live in a Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. In terms of self-preservation during the tenure process, I needed to get better explaining what I do as a valid method to people who see themselves as real scientists. And that's these pictures here. This is Fort Severn. This is as far north as you can go in Ontario. This is on the shores of Hudson Bay, and it's in polar bear country. So you have to be very careful when you go for walks all of the time. So my talk today draws on my experiences, on how my experience continues to shape my research. I also work from a position influenced by sociolinguistics. I am an anthropologist, and I don't tend to be a linguist, but I can't ignore the influence that having been trained by one of the original students of the founder of the field of sociolinguistics has influenced my work. So that influence is simple enough. For sociolinguists, we see society and language as the same thing. So if a social context is a result of interaction between two or more people, the only way that can happen is through language use. So if we pay attention to how language is used, we can learn a great deal about how it is we can learn a great deal about social power. That is why I want to link both community engagements and the stories we hear throughout this talk. And remember, this is going to be on the test later. So in recent years, I've stopped saying that I do Indigenous health research. As I will explain shortly, I'm attempting to decenter my research and focus on relationships. As part of that, I define the work that I do with First Nations as service. It's a service to them. It allows me to remove pressure to publish our work and to be the only grant holder. And it's allowed us now to make sure that the communities are holding the grants and have direction over where the research goes. It allows me to focus on their health priorities as I work with them. This is a small ethical decision that I have made. It has meant diversifying my own research away from the area where I was trained. However, it allows me to feel more comfortable doing the work that I do as a non-First Nations partner, working with First Nations communities. It also allows me to be more present in the community as a partner. And I believe that this is the next step for me as I think through the concept of relationship-based research. So this is a book chapter that one of my community partners and I published. And I'll talk about Leslie in a minute. So, okay, so this is not my story. It's one that was told a few years ago by a well-respected anthropologist from Canada. As the story goes, this anthropologist was staying with a family in the community that he's worked with for decades. And if things are going well in your field research, you're generally staying in someone's house. It's a community that had adopted him formally, so that's a big deal. And if you're familiar with Northern First Nation communities, you'll be aware that the airport, or what stands for an airport, is often many miles away from the homes. Flights come in at best daily, most often every few days. And because everything has to be flown in, the cost of food and gas is much higher than the rest of the country. Partner this with high levels of unemployment and very low incomes, and you get a situation where those of us who value these relationships try not to financially burden our hosts. So this anthropologist, knowing he was on the very early flight the next day, decided to take a taxi to the airport. It's 6 a.m., and this is long before his host would have normally woken up. The next day, he takes the taxi and to the little outbuilding that is the terminal. And I've been to some of these terminals that are 3 walls and a roof. It would have cost him about $50 for the trip. So he's sitting alone in the dark when he sees a car approaching. He thinks, great, someone else is on the flight, someone to talk to, and this is the anthropologist's bread and butter and research. As the car gets closer, he realizes it's another taxi with his host in it. The return cost would have cost them over $100. Embarrassed, he wonders what he's forgotten. A book, some clothing. What could it be? So the car pulls up and the host gets out. She's all of 5'8". He's over 6 foot tall. She proceeds to lay into him in Ojibwe, and it goes on for a while. She had a lot to say. Then she turns her back, gets in the car, and drives away. His offense was he didn't say goodbye. He paused here in the story and relates the moral. And this is the thing that has continued to influence my work. At the end of the day, all that matters is relationships. To this end, I've been thinking for a few years about the concept of relationship-based research. I do acknowledge that other fields, particularly social work, use this term. However, I do not believe we're using it in the same way. I am not studying relationships. I'm in the process of trying to articulate how relationships we form with our research partners become more than individual or even related projects. They need to become truly reciprocal relationships. In short, the relationship has to come first. Perhaps not temporally. They need to assume a position in our program that is more important than any one research project. Let me give you an example. In 2014, I was a postdoc at the University of Toronto in psychiatry, and this is Leslie, who I'm going to be talking about, who I wrote that book chapter with. I was embedded in a biomarker research team, which is not my natural habitat. And in the context, I started working with Leslie from a First Nation community north of Toronto. What started out as discussions about suicide prevention became programs for her youth in her community, and became a lasting friendship. We share a passion for ending these needless deaths. Leslie and I learned that we could do more for the youth in her community, if we had a positive relationship. Over the years, our relationship has grown in strength. We have co-developed ideas. We have visited each other's homes, figured out mutually beneficial plans. We have published together on the topic of relationship-based research. We have traveled to present at international conferences, and we've brought her really cute mom, and spent time fishing and making maple syrup in her community. Most important, most recently, she has joined me in my fun ghost story project, because we just like working with each other. There's no line for this on the CV, but the mutual benefits are significant. We both feel that we're able to do better work for the youth in her community because of our relationship. Similarly, the partnership I have at Walpole Island First Nation is one based on relationship first. I am mentored by a community from that community by an elder who has led their community engagement programs for over 40 years. We chat regularly as friends just to stay connected. When we see an opportunity where my skills are helpful, we explore it. These relationships are as much about meals and laughs as they are about research projects. As a result, we're able to do more together, and it has enhanced communication. This is where I work, the University of Western Ontario. It is a very pretty campus. So this sort of engagement requires a process of decentering. I argue that it consists of three interrelated elements: space, time, and power decentering. Decentering ourselves acknowledges that many of the populations we work with are populations facing negative health outcomes because they've been historically marginalized and disempowered through colonial, racialized, or other means. So let me talk about space for a while. We do work in some beautiful locations. This image is the university where I work. I'm based at the medical school, which is an impressive and well-established research institution. It's also a very conservative and traditional academic center where we, the highly trained researchers, I'm being facetious here, define the world as it is. We know the methods and we get the grants. We collect the data, we organize it, we analyze it for the good of humanity. We publish in the biggest journals. One of my colleagues jokingly refers to that as the knowledge factory. But that suggests that the university is the owner or creator of all valid knowledge. It gives way to a belief in authoritative knowledge. That is what counts and what does not count as knowledge. It sets knowledge on its own terms. However, knowledge and knowing are things that exist in all places. By situating ourselves within the physical context of the people we are working with, we can start to understand their knowledge, how their knowledge of our shared topic of interest is impacted by these spaces. This image is Walpole Island First Nation. It sits on unceded land bordering Canada and the United States, not far from Detroit. For those of you who are from the area, it's where the St. Clair River empties into Lake St. Clair on the river delta. They're upwind from the Dust Belt, and they sit approximately 10 miles downstream from what's known as Chemical Valley, home of a significant number of petrochemical plants. Their air, water, and land have been inundated with persistent pollutants since the development of North America's first industrial oil production in the region. This includes lead, mercury, and arsenic. They frame their knowledge based on the movement of the air and water. Similarly, their ecological knowledge is based on the same movements. We sit under two continental flyways for migrating birds. They are the center of the Great Lakes system. Their world expands out from them, not from the university. This is a place-based ontology. Benefits of working on site, spending time with people where they live, is a better understanding of how they understand what they know, and it allows me to see what they're saying rather than hearing or reading it. Take this photo for an example. So this is downtown Manhattan, not my natural habitat. If we think about social determinants of health as a system of interactions, consider how people living in a large urban center will experience a place like this differently than those who live at Walpole Island First Nation. How many of you can smell this image or hear it? By engaging with the places our partners are, we gain valuable knowledge about the whole world they live in. Imagine, for example, living in New York and asking participants to come to your office rather than meeting them where they are. If you are feeling uncomfortable going into their neighborhood, consider how your partner might feel coming into your office. These are the gentleman in the middle is Dan Smoke. Both these gentlemen have passed away. And Dan was an important mentor for me for many, many years. And George, if there's any Leaf fans, he was the Toronto Maple Leaf captain for many, many years. He's actually my PhD student's grandfather, and one of the first Indigenous people to play in the National Hockey League. I actually don't like hockey, so I'm not stereotypically Canadian that way. Anyway, time is the second element of decentering that I want to mention. As academics, many of us live on a September to August year and think in terms of 1, 2, or 3 year grant cycles. Personally, I work on a 3-year performance review cycle. However, our community partners do not follow the same cycles. I spent a number of years working in partnership with First Nations communities to support their youth. While there does appear to be a seasonality to suicide deaths in these communities, the process of supporting the communities is ongoing. I want to return back to the idea of relationship-based research. This approach allows me overlap the constraints of my own temporal limits with the needs of the community. There are great benefits to staying in touch with people, even if you do not have an academic ask. This aspect, I believe, is about empathy. It goes beyond the important step of physically meeting participants where they are and asks us to consider the deeper context of what is going on in their lives at the moment. It encourages us to consider both their histories, both as individuals and as a community. So as a white man working with First Nations, I need to be conscious of the ongoing role of colonization that has on the lives of the people that I work with, plus how this system provides me with privileges. This empathy is also about avoiding systemic violence that might come from expecting our partners to live on our timelines. That's a spooky ghost. So finally, the third element I want to mention in terms of decentering is power. Let me make a quick reference to my ghost story research to help me demonstrate what I mean by power. And I just like to talk about ghosts. Let's be clear, I'm not engaged in paranormal research. I'm not trying to prove or disprove the existence of ghosts. The stories are tools. And if you spend enough time with anthropologists, you'll hear us say that's a good thing to think with. That's what ghost stories are. There's something to think with rather than about. And as it turns out, ghost stories allow us to think about power relationships in society. My reasoning for using these stories is simple. Ghost stories are ubiquitous within our society. Unlike experience-based narratives, you don't have to have experienced a ghost or ghost story. When he was developing sociolinguistics, William Labov, my supervisor, would ask participants to tell him about a time when something happened to them. It's a very simple but effective cue for gathering narrative data, right? Or as we call them, stories. My favorite work of his was a book he wrote based on the question, tell me about a time you almost died. Oh, there's my dog barking. But if I was asked the group to tell me about a time they saw a ghost, few, if any of you, would put up your hands. Now, how many of you know a ghost story? Right? So in terms of a means of data collection, ghost stories make the collection of narrative data very simple. They provide a lot. And it's fun data. The fact that so many stories I hear are retellings of well-known stories is also proven to be helpful. This goes beyond saturation, as I'll discuss shortly. And also, ghost stories, they're generally safe narratives. So I built my career working in areas that include non-suicidal self-injury and suicide. These are not stories that are always safe to retell or to be told. And a lot of people don't like to hear them. And while we know that talking about suicide in a productive manner does not increase risk, it is a topic that many people shy away from. I also feel that I have a moral obligation to do more with those stories than just experiment on them like I am with the ghost stories. And finally, I just like ghost stories. I'm an Irish immigrant. I come from Belfast, so I grew up with ghost stories all around me. My grandmother would always ring the doorbell at our house, even though she had been dead for 30 years, and in Ireland, so we're not sure how she found us. So doing something with what I like. But back to the repeated stories that I mentioned earlier. As an inductive researcher, anthropologists often support our observations with inspirations we take from the social world. This is an important element of community engagement because this gives us something to think with. For example, while listening to one of my favorite podcasts on folktales, it's called The Lore Men. I really recommend it. It's British. I had a revelation dropped in my lap. One of the guests made a passing comment about how stories are often told reflects the social location and power of the tellers. They didn't say it like that. That's the academic interpretation. Of course they do. So let me demonstrate with a story that I have in print, but I've also been told in person from different perspectives to draw us back to this idea of power. It involves the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto, Canada, and the ghost of Dorothy. It's one of the very popular classes of story where unrequited love leads to the death of a young woman. In the newspaper, the Toronto Star version of the story, Dorothy was an attractive young brunette who may have been despondent over a love affair. And that runs through all of these stories. In this version, the death was at a bank, keeping with the location in downtown Toronto. But other versions of this tale take place in a mill or a factory or a hotel. And generally, the general elements of the story remain across, they're same across tellings. Two young lovers, never meant to be, she dies or is killed. Her ghost haunts the bank or the mill or the factory or the hotel. However, what does change in the telling is why she died. Often, in the heteronormative and official version, she has taken her own life because the affair couldn't happen. Usually, she was in love with someone above her social class, and the affair was socially unacceptable. Usually, it's the son of the owner or son of the owner of the bank or the mill or the factory or the hotel. However, when the story is told by an individual who has a worldview different from the dominant heteronormative view of the story, why she died changes. So the causality in the story changes. Most often, it becomes a murder where the powerful son is taking advantage of the younger woman from the lower social class, power abusing the powerless. This is what we call framing in narrative analysis, and how the problem or plot, which is how the problem or plot of a story is set. The story is framed as overreaching or an abuse of power. Consider how important the framing of causes is to many of our research programs. This difference helps. There's my dog again. Hopefully you guys can't hear that.
We can't.
Okay, I can. She's driving me nuts.
I know. I know how that goes.
It's the school across the road has had the indignity to let their children out for lunch. So where was I here? The difference makes this class of story important in my research. The form remains the same. The specific are changed based on the positionality of the teller. In it, I'm able to differentiate two areas of exploration, which I transfer to my relationship-based research. The first is that of durability. The mill or factory ghost has been around as long as we've had mills and factories and the social stratification that maintain them. The stories are durable in that they are retold. The second, they are diffused globally. Retelling is not the result of many similar ghosts. Instead, they are a result of many similar tellings, not unique creations, but rather the retelling of stories that have traveled with the tellers. So here, in these two elements, we can start to think about power. The power to recreate or retell stories is an important one. It raises the question of who has the power to have their stories told and who has the power to tell it. If we are centered in the dominant way of knowing, we run the risk of ignoring important stories told to us by our partners because they don't agree with our versions of what we know. However, if we allow ourselves and our research to be centered, we open up our work to a potential for different ways of knowing, different ways to understand people's experiences. How am I doing for time if I want to do this quick aside? I'm not going to do the quick aside. Okay, let's get away from the scary ghost. That is a tree in Northern Ontario. It's hundreds of years old and it's about 4 feet high because the growing season's very short. So let me add one more qualification here. Decentering does not mean giving up yourself. In reality, the fastest way to destroy community engagement is to try and be someone you're not. Frauds get nowhere in the long run. The first piece of advice I give my students when they head out into the field is to be yourself. Being honestly able to say, I don't know, or I'm trying, or to make a mistake and get laughed at goes a long way to building trust. Without that trust, you're not able to engage with anyone. I know things are going well for me with my in communities with partners I work with. If I'm being mocked by older women, this is a sign of respect and acceptance. And with the Anishinaabe that I work with, the older women get to make those jokes very sexual. and I'm not allowed to reciprocate. So with the concept of power and decentering, I want to touch on another aspect of knowledge, and that's that of multi-stability. In the context of community engagement, this is a way to consider that something can mean more than one thing, but that it can't mean everything. So I might be speaking with a community partner on a topic, but we may not be meaning the same thing. And I need to be always be conscious of this. So allow me to share one more story to demonstrate this point. When I travel in the US for work, I might be asked where I went to college. Many of us who trained in Canada didn't go to college. We went to university. In the US, college and university, it seems, are largely interchangeable terms. With college being, my experiences being college is the one you guys use most frequently. In Canada, college and universities are two completely different streams of education, where colleges do not offer degrees until fairly recently. Now some do. And they're 2-year programs, whereas universities are degree granting. So when I joined a swim team in Ithaca, where I was living for a year, and was asked where I swam in college, my answer was, and it could have been, I didn't swim in college because I'm slow. It was, I didn't go to college. My dog is driving me nuts. And this, of course, confused the asker, who knew I was faculty at a university. Anyway, you sure you can't hear her? Okay. Anyway, allow.
Yeah, Gerald, I don't hear anything, so, but if
Okay.
you take a minute to like calm her down or whatever, it's all good.
Oh, my son just came in and he's got her. So this allows for another beneficial level of analysis. When we're where our partners are, which is one thing that anthropologist Greg Urban refers to simply as the process of decontextualization and recontextualization. So in his study of the movement of ideas in and between social settings, a study he refers to as metaculture, Urban defines the process through which meaning of an idea in its original context is replaced by a new meaning of the same idea in a new context. It works within the simple axiom of the trait of those of us who study language and stories, that meaning is always context dependent. This is important because when we move what people tell us and what we should not expect it to be a simple one-to-one transmission. Place, time, and power all intersect to alter, even if it's only slightly, the meaning of what we've been told. Right? Isn't this fun? But of course, we need evidence to support our arguments, which brings me back to the methodologies and the qualitative methodology gap I mentioned at the beginning. What counts as evidence in both areas differs, in part because we're asking different sorts of questions, and then people like me come along and problematize it. But I want you to see that as an asset, not as a problem. So in the time remaining, I want to walk through a few basic approaches that can be used to explore what I've been discussing. So let's start with one used by linguists that I honestly have found not very useful, but it's one of the most commonly used ones. And it's just word lists or counts. So with this method, you count the number of times specific words are used in a story. The idea being that two similar discourses should use similar words. And this sets us up for your basic thematic analysis. I found, for example, that this does not generate useful data when working with environmental policy across cultures, because the language is so circumscribed, and we also need to be careful that the themes are actually meaningful to our partners rather than to ourselves. So who's generating those themes? So one tool we can use, and one that I think is helpful, is indexing language. This is simply looking for words that point to something. Gender pronouns are an example of indexing. They point to a person's gender identity. Similarly, being introduced in a community setting as Professor McKinley points to a very different sort of relationship than my brother Gerald. One suggests outsider and highlights a certain level of power. One is inside and familiar. Indexing helps us understand where our partners see the border of their communities. This is a good place to start and can help us understand if the issues we are investigating is specific to an individual or is representative of the whole community. For example, my problem with X is that we, ... insert whatever causality thing. This issue links X with the community through we. It can also help us to understand community level perspectives on the causality of X. Do they index it internally or externally? All right. So in the communities I work with, the suicide is almost always exclusively indexed externally into towards colonization. Correctly so. So I believe this to be an important when we're looking at situations where colonization, racism, and other forms of violence are part of the issue. I like to get this data with simple questions. For example, can you tell me where about living a good life and what that means to you? Right. So this image I put up here is from Mark Carney's speech a couple of weeks ago. That's our prime minister. And here you can see the indexing terms. I've bolded them: I, you, other countries, Canada, they, our, and various states. So they're pointing in very specific directions. The next tool that we use, and let me just move this up here, are called calicates. We tend to learn about certain words that go together, usually identified as left or right calicates. They act as signals from our experience. We get used to seeing certain things together. We can learn a lot about how people see things by understanding these pairings. They're often very value laden. If I could be a bit cheeky, think about military intelligence in the context of the United States right now. So this is again from that same speech, and you can see some of the calicates I've connected here. Great power, rule-based, must suffer. Right. So these are things that when you see great power, it automatically creates a mental image for you, and all cultures use them. And when you learn to understand them, you can get a better sense of what's happening in the community. This continues on from the same example. Strong tendency, that automatically is going to tell us something. Avoid trouble, buy safety. Right. So again, very value laden. The next part, and here I'm doing some American content for you, is cotext. So cotext is different from context. Context is a situation where you're collecting your data. Cotext is the surrounding lines of text from an interview, usually a few lines or a paragraph. That said, I generally avoid paragraphs when I do my transcription and instead just divide by independent clauses. Provides insight into how an argument is framed. It moves beyond thematic analysis at the word level into a relationship between words. It allows for greater understanding of some of the tools employed by the speaker or the writer to make their case. So this is Joe Biden's State of the Union address from 2021. And you can see how he's connecting crisis and opportunity, rebuilding and revitalization, right? So he's having you coming out of a crisis and giving you an opportunity to rebuild. It's a very positive type of message, right? So if you were just take crisis as a thematic point, you might assume that the tone is dark. But when you connect that with opportunity, rebuilding, and notion, you get a temporal gap or a temporal transition out of crisis into rebirth and rehope. The next thing that we can use is metaphor. And these really are very important because our language is ultimately metaphorical. This comes from the same speech. And here I've highlighted some of the metaphors. Knock us down, stay down, arising anew. So the first two are essentially boxing metaphors or fighting metaphors, which would tie us back to the earlier paragraph on crisis. But then we get into almost a biblical, and he had mentioned the Bible earlier, arising anew, light over darkness. So you get these contrasts in battles going on. And what these do is they frame what people are talking about and help us understand what's going on. So what? I think that's an important question to ask ourselves. One area that I hope to make an impact with this work is thinking about community community engagement is what I call perlocutionary indexing. I'm interested in signaling sites of social inclusion. That is to say, the process through which an active language indexes insider-outsider roles, not through overt statements, but rather through connections to shared understandings or meaning, especially for youth who are feeling excluded from their communities. So if I can just be a linguistics nerd for a minute, locution is what is said. Illocution is what you want to happen. Perlocution is the affect it has on you. So if we're all together in Ann Arbor and Monica comes into the room and says very nicely, "Can you come see me?" We're all going to feel good, right? So the locution is what she said. The illocution is we're going to go and have a conversation with Monica, and we're going to be excited because we all like to spend time with Monica. Now, if Monica comes into the room and is very stern and says, "Can you come with me?" says the same words, it has the same thing that we're going to follow her into the hall. The perlocution aspect of it is now I'm nervous. What have I done? Right? If I've got Monica mad, I've gone too far. Right? So I'm interested in that affective aspect of language. So I think it's a process that incorporates the history and social orientations associated with specific language use. It's an approach built upon a foundation of cognitive anthropology and one that I'm tracing through metaphors. And I'm drawing on George Lakoff and Rick Johnson and their insights that metaphor allow us to understand one set of experiences in terms of another, and that understanding takes place in terms of entire sets of experiences, not in isolations, right? It's really that gestalt of what's going on in people's lives and how they're communicating it. And ultimately, you need to be in the community and spending time with people to understand that and hear it. And I think it's important for us to see others, particularly others with authority, sharing the same conceptual understandings if we want to feel healthy. I think it's important in understanding how some of the First Nations youth that I work with internalize stories about them, and think about the language that's coming out of some of your political leaders. I'll put that in scare quotes, and how many of you may not feel connected with your own society right now. Oh, I'm supposed to have another slide here of my fieldwork, which I did not put in. So my advice for anyone working in this area, especially if you're new in your career, write papers documenting soft skills as methodologies. These are important things that we need to document and have out there. And our colleagues in the sciences write papers on their methodologies. We should be too. Build the foundation for your security through peer-reviewed publications. Also consider that time is a currency in relationship-based research. I can do years of research on less money than what some of my colleagues spend on a weekly basis on their labs, but I cannot pump out papers monthly. An important aspect of relationship-based research, where time and power intersect, is understanding that working with our partners to solve problems takes priority over a paper. I know this sounds odd, but if you publish on your soft skills, you can demonstrate output while protecting your valued relationships. The papers will come from the projects, and every project I've worked on, we have published, and in some very top journals. It can't be pressured. It just can't be rushed. So I feel like I should end this with some big takeaway. I know I ramble. So I think I'll keep it simple. I strongly believe that the key to effective community engagement is based in relationships. I also believe that we can learn a lot of value from listening to stories told by those with whom we have these relationships. Some of the stories I've been told are very hard to hear, stories of violence and death. Other stories lift you up. When Leslie and I published on relationship work, she included a story about a dream she had after the death of a loved one. For the Anishinaabe, dreams are a form of reality. So if it happens to you in your dream, it's as much as it happened to you while you're awake. Her inclusion of the story was for her community. It explained what we had written in academic terms in their own ways. I value that she included me in this telling. And from there, I will pause. These are how you can connect with me. I do not use LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn account, but I've not really done it. There's my email, and you can always connect with me through um, through the MIWI group. Also, I have a fun Instagram account where I'm documenting my experiences returning to a life of sport and competitive triathlon with my anxiety disorder. It's a mix of like, here's what's going on in my life, and here's what the evidence says. So this is my confused Wahlberg. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you for listening to me while I ramble. I'll get rid of Mark here.
We get to see the dog. The infamous puppy that great job, by the way.
Well, thanks.
Fantastic.
The dog has disappeared. My
Okay.
son might have locked her in a crate. I see. Oh, Brianna's husband grew up at Walpole. What a small world. Did I weird everyone?
I had a question.
Yes.
When you talk
Nobody
about
else.
relationships, being, a currency,
Mhm.
how have you, I don't know, been able to kind of balance that with, you know, the demands of like output?
Yeah. So that's where um, I've published other areas while I've been working on the relationships. And we have, like Leslie and I have published a few papers together in a book chapter. The work that we've done at Walpole, you know, we've done some very good publications out of that too. Um, I've also been very clear on how I communicate with my colleagues, because they know I'm different. They're all pathologists and I'm an anthropologist. I'm the only one who doesn't work with dead bodies in my building. Um, so just explaining to them the work that I do and why it's important, and having the good luck that they've listened to me. Yeah, and I tend not to think about the relationships as currency. I think it is the foundation, right? Time is a currency, right? Because it's something we have to spend. But the relationships really, if you don't have them, you can't do this work in over the long term.
Hi, Gerald.
Hi, Charity. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I just wanted to know if you have any pointers on how to uplift the importance of storytelling and research with the push for quantitative research always being kind of the gold standard. How do you uplift the importance of storytelling as a form of research
Yeah,
when we don't always see that value?
yeah. So I've learned to use the terms of my colleagues, right? So in that paper, a few times I mentioned that I do inductive research, right? I never Anthropologists don't talk like that. I've learned to say that, so that my colleagues who are lab based understand that I'm not doing experiments, I'm doing inductive research, right? So I brought them into I framed it that way. I then also talked to them very specifically, and I put this in a few of my papers, and I always include it in my talks that I do in my department, that there's a difference between knowing that something is happening and knowing why it's happening, right? And if we know something is happening, we need that, which is where the quantitative comes in. Qualitative and listening to stories can give us a sense of why it's happening, or rather even why people think it's happening, right? So then it becomes about communication, and it becomes about solving the problem so that we can reduce the number of instances at time. So I try to reframe it into their processes of thinking.
It makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Gerald. Thank you so much for your talk. That was super helpful.
Thank you.
I was curious about the aspect of time that you mentioned. And so
Mhm.
I have tried to engage with like a community partner organization, and we found that we ended up like creating a workshop for the community, and it was amazing. And just being on the tenure track, it took a very long time. And so,
Mhm.
how do you have any tips or strategies about the aspect of, not rushing things and being on my clock, for example, but also knowing that I am on the tenure track? Do you have any
Yeah, it's tough, right? When I was on tenure track, I was told 3 publications a year.
mhm.
And I'm trying to establish these relationships, and we're going out for Kentucky Fried Chicken, and we're not doing any real work.
Yeah.
In my world, we were doing massive amounts of work. So what I found helpful was publishing little things along the line. So
Mhm.
rather than thinking about process or outcome publications, thinking about process publications,
Mm.
right? So focusing on, okay, here's what we did in order to get to the point where we could do the workshop, right? And here's all of the things that needed to
Mhm.
happen, right? That's process focused. And
Mhm.
then when you publish the paper on the outcomes of the publication, you can cite yourself, right? So yeah, it became about shifting it to the process of engagement as opposed to we saved 3 lives and 3 less people have diabetes. And yeah, is that helpful? Did I actually
Yes,
answer your
yes,
question?
that was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Gerald. I don't really have any questions, but as a fellow anthropologist, I'm just really appreciative of the entirety of this talk, like from how you started it and discussed using a script and why, to like the way you framed everything. And honestly, you answered a lot of questions that I kind of like thought I would ask, but just in your talk. So I'm just, and there was a point where I was like, oh, and it's recorded. Like, this is so great. So just, it was such a good talk. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Nice to hear from a fellow anthropologist. Where did you train? Remind me.
Northwestern.
Northwestern. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We probably have time for another question if anybody has anything burning or not burning.
Don't burn anything.
Right.
It's cold, but it's not that cold.
My dog's now going insane.
It was transferred.
Hi, Gerald. I just wanted to say hi and thank you so much for your talk as well. I was actually really interested in the ghost part of the talk. Um, I come from an area of the Philippines where my ancestors are known to be something called aswang. And I always told people like when I was growing up, I'm like, I'm 1/16th ghost. So would love to like pick your brain around that more at some point.
Yeah.
Um, and then I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about this idea of calling, moving away from calling your research with Indigenous or First Nations as service, because I'm also a mentee through ERIE, so the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. And so that really resonated with me. And so was wondering about like that personal ethical move that you said.
Yeah. That's a great question. So as you know, the relationship between universities and indigenous communities has not always been great. And research and anthropologists, we are very guilty of this. We were the spearhead of colonization, right? So and with the history of like helicopter researchers and all of the communities I worked with have had people show up, collect data, and disappear, and nothing changes in the community. Right. So I wanted to ethically move myself away from that. I can't move myself away from that history completely because I'm part of it. but I wanted to just start to reframe what we should be doing with the communities, and that we shouldn't be seeing them as sites of data, right? I think we have a moral obligation to be supporting communities on their terms, rather than on our own. And I think service is a better word for that than research. Because then it becomes about, and Leslie, like when we talk about the youth in her community, she doesn't say suicide, she says we don't want them to leave, right? So then the service becomes about making sure the children stay, right? Because they're the future generation of the community, so that you're protecting the future of the community, right? So it's it is partly tied up with that, like there's a really dark history of what research is. Are you familiar with the residential schools in Canada? And you had boarding schools in the US. They were used as sites for research by some of our most prestigious universities, right? And there was a study that was found a few years ago where they were literally starving the kids and giving them vitamins to see how long soldiers could live in the field in battle without nutrition if they had pill packs, right? That's the kind of history I don't want to be associated with. I want to be associated with what is it can and in the communities I work with, one of the best things that I'm called is a helper, right? So I want to be a helper.
Gerald, I just had a quick follow-up to like what someone else asked earlier. I know we're at time, but you said that it was really challenging, like as you were on the tenure track, in terms of you had like the research requirement of the 3 pubs a year. I'm not sure what you had to do with grants. And yet, building the relationships to me is almost like essential to even getting a grant. Because like, how can you have data on people, which is literally,
Yeah.
but I don't know whether that's qualitative or quantitative data, truth be told, they're still bodies. So it's always strange to me how we are like supposed to get grants on like, human beings, but that the component of the relationship building is not built into or baked into our job.
Yeah.
Or people will say, well, that's just service, but that's like the smallest part of your job, no matter what institution you're at. I mean, whether you're at a teaching institution or a research institution. So how did you, and I also feel that like as a white male, that comes with its own privilege. Like when you do even enter a space and community, that brings some level sometimes of credibility and people get excited. Like I even know me when I see, as a Black woman versus like a counterpart that's a male, regardless of color, people are like, oh, what can I do for you? And a little bit different reception for me. How did you sort of navigate that when you were early in your career?
Yeah. I was very lucky, white maleness aside. Right. I have so many privileges. I say to some of my students, like, people think I'm smart because of the color of my skin. Right. So there are a lot of privileges that I carry with me that way. But I was also very lucky that I was protected by a very powerful woman, who was my supervisor, who was at the end of her career. And so she had nothing left to prove. And she very much protected me. And I'm eternally grateful for what Regna did for me. I also, serendipity was a big part of it as well. Like that thing there I mentioned where I met Leslie, that came about because I was in a change room sitting beside a guy who had an Irish accent. And I said to him, where are you from? From in Ireland. I'm from Belfast. And we started chatting, and he was a psychiatrist working at the University of Toronto in suicide research. And I said, I'm doing my postdoc in suicide research. And he invited me out for lunch with his boss, who is the person who had a $25 million grant to study research in Ontario. And when I asked him, what are you doing in Indigenous communities? He said nothing, and I had nothing to lose. So I said, well, you need to be, because they are, 3% of the population, they're a quarter of the deaths. And the next day I got an email from them with an offer of a research assistant and some money. Right. And that was just luck. Well, and the whole Irish thing, because the other guy was also Irish.
The luck of the Irish?
Luck of the Irish.
Never mind, no pun intended.
Yeah.
Like the poorly flipper.
Yeah, no, but ultimately I left that relationship And I talked to Leslie because like we were sitting with so much money. Like the types of money they were giving me, I couldn't apply for that kind of grant money. And I called Leslie one day and said, I think I need to leave. I'm uncomfortable with this biomarker research that they're doing because I think they want your community just as biological samples. And Leslie said, good, let's go. Right. So I was very lucky that the relationship was strong enough that I could say, I know this is a stupid thing to do to walk away from this much money, especially like as an assistant professor to walk away from $25 million project. But it was the
That's
right
really
thing.
helpful. Yeah, it
Yeah.
sounds
And
like you had some good people along the way, but also maybe
yeah.
even partnering with one key person in the community that has
Mhm.
that real relationship with the community already and sort of
Yeah.
establishing that trust, even if that takes some time, that maybe can then lead to opening doors for you to do the type of work that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Having someone who can introduce you in is so valuable.
Awesome. Thank you,
Yeah.
Gerald.